"Don't ever come back here," my father said, his voice cold and final in a way that made my stomach drop. And I stood there in their living room with my small suitcase at my feet, watching snow fall past the window behind him, fat flakes drifting down through the darkness like some cruel mockery of a Hallmark Christmas card. My mother stood beside him, arms crossed, her face set in that expression of disappointed resignation I'd seen my entire life, the one that said I had once again failed to be the daughter they needed me to be. It was Christmas Eve, and I was being thrown out of my childhood home because I'd committed the unforgivable sin of saying no. No, I wouldn't give them $50,000 for my brother Marcus's third business venture. This one a restaurant concept he'd been planning for 6 months with the same enthusiasm and lack of actual business planning that had characterized his previous two failures. The money sat in my savings account, carefully accumulated over 6 years of working two jobs, eating ramen more nights than I wanted to count, living in a studio apartment barely bigger than their garage, saving every spare dollar for the dream I'd been building in secret, the app I'd spent 3 years developing in the hours between midnight and dawn. But they didn't know about that. Didn't know about TaskFlow Pro or the 2,000 beta users or the venture capital meeting I had scheduled for January, because I'd learned long ago that my dreams were background noise in the symphony of Marcus's needs. "You've always been selfish, Sarah," my mother said, and her words landed like stones in my chest, each one sinking into the familiar bruise of being the family disappointment, the one who got a full scholarship to state university while Marcus got $80,000 for business school, the one whose college graduation they missed to attend Marcus's anniversary dinner, the one whose 25th birthday was forgotten while they threw Marcus a surprise party for his 27th. I wanted to scream at them, to list every time they'd chosen him over me, every achievement they'd dismissed, every time they'd asked me for money while giving him everything, but my throat was tight and my eyes were burning, and all I could manage was, "I'm sorry you feel that way." My father's jaw clenched. "If you walk out that door without reconsidering, you're not welcome back. We don't need a daughter who abandons her family." Something in me cracked then, some last fragile hope that they might see me, really see me, and I bent down to pick up my suitcase, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. "Then I guess this is goodbye," I said, and walked past them into the hallway, past the photos on the wall where Marcus smiled from every frame while I appeared in maybe 1 out of 5, past the coat closet where I grabbed my jacket with numb fingers, and out into the snow that immediately began melting on my burning cheeks. Mixing with tears, I was too tired to hold back anymore. Before continuing the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers to be able to bring you stories like this every day. For you, it's just a click, but for me, it means a lot. The pattern had been there my entire life, woven so deeply into the fabric of our family that I didn't even recognize it as abnormal until college, when my roommate asked why I never talked about my parents, and I realized I had nothing good to say. Marcus was born first, arriving 3 years before me with a full head of dark hair and what my mother always called your father's determined chin. And from that moment forward, he became the sun around which our family orbited while I was some distant moon, cold and forgotten in the darkness. He got $80,000 for business school at Northwestern, a prestigious MBA program he barely graduated from after 2 extensions and a remedial statistics course, while I got a handshake and, "We're so proud you earned that scholarship," when I was accepted to State University with a full ride that covered everything: tuition and room and board, the scholarship I'd worked myself sick to earn, with a 4.2 GPA, and 3 AP classes, and volunteer work at the library every Saturday for 2 years. "Not a real school," my aunt said at a family dinner when I was 18, and my parents didn't correct her, didn't point out that I'd gotten into State's honors program, or that I'd be studying computer science in one of the best public tech programs in the region. They just smiled and changed the subject to Marcus's upcoming graduation and the interviews he had lined up at consulting firms. When Marcus bought his first house at 25, they gave him $60,000 for the down payment, told everyone at the open house how proud they were to help him start building equity, and I was there serving drinks to guests and listening to my father explain that real estate was the foundation of wealth, that Marcus was making smart choices, and when I mentioned that I'd been accepted into an advanced algorithms course that could lead to research opportunities, my mother patted my hand and said, "That's nice, dear," before turning back to discuss Marcus's crown molding. His wedding cost $42,000. I know, because I saw the invoice on my mother's desk when I was looking for stamps, a lavish affair at a vineyard with 200 guests and a live band and flowers shipped in from Portland. While my graduation from state with highest honors and a job offer from a tech startup happened on a Saturday they couldn't attend because it was Marcus and Jennifer's anniversary and they'd planned a surprise dinner at that expensive steakhouse downtown. I was 22 years old, wearing my cap and gown, standing in a crowd of celebrating families, and my phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "So sorry, sweetie, you understand. Take lots of pictures for us." No pictures of me in that royal blue gown with the gold honors cord ever made it onto their mantle. But Marcus's MBA graduation photo held the central position in the living room, flanked by his wedding portrait and a professional family photo that included his 2 kids. My 25th birthday was on a Tuesday that year, and I waited all day for a call or text, watching my phone during my lunch break and telling myself they were planning to call in the evening. But evening came and went with silence, and I found out 2 days later through Facebook that they'd thrown Marcus a surprise party for his 27th birthday. A big backyard barbecue with all the relatives and a cake from that French bakery he liked. And when I called my mother to ask why she hadn't mentioned it, she sighed and said they'd planned it last minute and, "You're always so busy with work, we didn't think you'd be able to make it." The breaking point came 2 weeks before that Christmas Eve banishment. On a Tuesday evening in early December, when my mother called and asked me to come to dinner that weekend, her voice carrying that artificial brightness that meant she wanted something. And I showed up on Saturday with a bottle of wine and a knot of anxiety in my stomach that I'd learned to recognize as my body's early warning system for family gatherings. Marcus and Jennifer were already there, sitting on the cream-colored couch in the living room that we'd never been allowed to sit on as children, and my parents were hovering in that way that signaled this wasn't just a casual dinner. This was a presentation, a pitch, and I was the target audience of one. We made it through the pot roast and small talk before my father cleared his throat and said, "Sarah, we wanted to talk to you about an exciting opportunity." And I watched Marcus shift in his seat, not quite meeting my eyes, while Jennifer reached over to squeeze his hand in a gesture that was probably meant to be supportive, but looked more like bracing for impact. My father explained that Marcus had been developing a restaurant concept, farm-to-table cuisine with a focus on local ingredients, a space he'd found in the renovated warehouse district that was becoming trendy, and the way he described it, you'd think Marcus had discovered the cure for cancer instead of the same basic concept that 40 other restaurants in the city were already doing. "The opportunity," my mother said, leaning forward with her hands clasped on the table, "is for you to finally contribute something meaningful to this family." And the words landed like a slap, even though I should have been used to them by now. Should have developed thicker skin after 25 years of being the footnote in their family story. They needed $50,000, my father said, for the final build-out and equipment, and Marcus had investors lined up, but they were short on this last piece. And, "We know you've been saving your money, living in that tiny apartment, not spending on anything," my mother added, as if my frugality was somehow shameful rather than necessary. I felt something cold settle in my chest, that same feeling I'd had when I was 12 and overheard my mother telling my aunt that I was the practical one, while Marcus was the dreamer. As if practicality was a consolation prize for not being loved the same way. "I can't do that," I said, my voice quieter than I wanted it to be, and the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees instantly. "What do you mean you can't?" my father asked, his expression hardening into that look of disappointment I knew so well it could have been my own reflection. I tried to explain. my words coming out jumbled and defensive, that I had plans for my savings, that I'd been working on something for 3 years, that I needed that money for my own business, and Marcus actually laughed, a short, bitter sound that made my face burn. "What business?" he said. "Sarah, you're an administrative assistant at a startup that'll probably fold in a year. What kind of business are you starting?" Jennifer nodded beside him, her expression sympathetic in that condescending way that made it worse somehow, and said, "After everything they've done for you, after everything they've sacrificed, you can't help your brother with this one thing?" I looked at my mother, hoping for something, some acknowledgement that maybe I deserved to have dreams too, but she just said, "We gave you life, Sarah. You owe us more than your bank account." And I realized with a clarity that was almost physically painful that they would never see me as anything other than a resource to be tapped when Marcus needed something. My father sat back in his chair, arms crossed, silent, but radiating disapproval, and I stood up from the table, my legs shaking, and said, "I'm sorry, but my answer is no," and walked out of that house with tears streaming down my face, and my mother's voice calling after me that I was making a mistake I'd regret. The text came the next morning, just 7 words from my mother. "You're not welcome at Christmas unless you reconsider." And I stared at it for 20 minutes, my coffee going cold in my hand, trying to decide if I should fight for a place at a table where I'd never really had a seat. I decided to go to Christmas Eve dinner anyway, carrying that decision like a stone in my chest for the 2 weeks between my mother's ultimatum text and December 24th, telling myself that maybe if I showed up with gifts and goodwill, they would see that I wasn't trying to hurt them, that I just needed them to respect my choices the way they'd always respected Marcus's. And I spent more than I should have on presents, a cashmere scarf for my mother in the deep blue she loved, a leather portfolio for my father, a complicated building set for Marcus's kids, wrapping each one carefully in my apartment while snow fell outside my window, and I practiced what I might say to make them understand. I arrived at 6:30, the time my mother had specified in the original invitation before everything fell apart, and I stood on the porch with my shopping bag of gifts and my heart hammering against my ribs, watching through the front window as my family moved around inside, Marcus helping my father with something in the kitchen, Jennifer setting the table, my mother adjusting the centerpiece, and for a moment I almost turned around and left because they looked so complete without me, like a photograph that didn't need another person cluttering the frame. My mother opened the door when I knocked, her expression flickering through surprise and something harder before settling on cold politeness, and she said, "Sarah," in a tone that made my name sound like a question she didn't particularly want answered, taking the bag of gifts from my hands without looking inside, setting it on the hall table without ceremony while I removed my coat with trembling fingers. Marcus was in the living room, and he wouldn't meet my eyes, suddenly fascinated by his phone, while Jennifer gave me a tight smile that didn't reach anywhere near her eyes, and my father just nodded from his armchair, his face set in that expression of disappointment I'd been seeing my entire life, the one that said I'd already failed before I'd even begun. We made it through the appetizers in near silence, just the sound of chewing and ice clinking in glasses, and then we sat down to dinner, my mother's famous standing rib roast that she only made for Christmas, and I was trying to think of something neutral to say when my father cleared his throat and said loudly, as if we were in a much bigger room, "So, Sarah, have you thought about family loyalty?" I felt my face flush hot, my hands gripping my fork too tightly, and I tried to explain again, my voice shaking slightly, that I was starting a business, that I needed the capital, that I had plans and dreams too, and Marcus actually scoffed, a sound of derision that cut through the air like a blade, and said, "What business? You're a glorified secretary, Sarah. You answer phones and schedule meetings. What kind of business are you starting?" I looked at him then, really looked at him, at my older brother who'd been given every advantage and squandered most of them, and I felt something shift inside me, some final thread of patience snapping, and I said clearly, "I've developed a productivity app called TaskFlow Pro. I've been working on it for 3 years. I have 2,000 beta users with a 4.8 star rating, and I have a meeting with a venture capital firm in January. And the words hung in the air like smoke while my family stared at me, with expressions ranging from shock to disbelief to what looked almost like anger. My mother was the first to speak, setting down her wine glass with a sharp click against the table, saying, "That's a fantasy, Sarah. Marcus has a real opportunity, a physical restaurant with investors and a business plan." And I felt something inside me crumbling, the last foolish hope that maybe they would be proud, that maybe this would be enough to make them see me differently. The argument escalated from there, my father listing everything Marcus had accomplished with their help, the MBA, the house, the wedding, as if these things proved his worth while my scholarship and my job and my app were just hobbies, just little diversions that didn't matter, and I finally asked the question I'd been swallowing for years. Why doesn't he deserve the same support you've always given him? Why am I not worth investing in? My father's face hardened into something cold and final, and he said words I will never forget, words that burned themselves into my memory like brands. Marcus was worth investing in, Sarah. He's proven himself, but you've never been exceptional at anything. You've always been just average, and we're not going to throw money at your little project when there's a real opportunity for this family. I stood up from the table, my chair scraping loud against the hardwood floor, my whole body shaking with hurt and rage and a grief so profound I could barely breathe, and I said with my voice breaking, "I'm not giving you my money." And my father stood too, his face red, his voice hard, and said, "Then don't ever come back here." And my mother who'd carried me for 9 months and raised me for 25 years, nodded and added, "We don't need a daughter who abandons family when we need her most." I picked up my coat from the hall closet, left the bag of presents sitting unopened on the table, and walked out into the snow that was falling thick and white, and I didn't look back even though I wanted to, even though part of me hoped someone would follow me and take it all back. I walked to the bus stop 4 blocks away through snow that was falling so thick I could barely see 10 feet ahead of me, each step crunching through the accumulation that was already 3 inches deep and getting deeper. And I wasn't dressed for this kind of weather, because I'd thought I'd be inside my parents' warm house eating pie and opening presents, not trudging through a Christmas Eve blizzard with tears freezing on my cheeks and my dress shoes soaking through with icy water. The cold was absolute, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes you wonder if you'll ever be warm again. And my fingers were numb where they clutched my purse, my only possession besides the clothes on my back and the phone in my pocket that stayed stubbornly silent. No one calling to say they were sorry, to say they'd made a mistake, to ask me to come back. I kept thinking about my father's face when he told me never to return, the certainty in his voice, the way my mother had nodded in agreement, and I wondered if I actually was selfish, if maybe they were right and I was wrong, if choosing myself over Marcus made me the villain in a story where I'd always tried so hard to be good enough to earn a place at their table. The bus came after 15 minutes that felt like hours, and I climbed aboard with shaking legs, the warmth inside hitting me like a wall, making my frozen skin burn and tingle as sensation returned, and I found a seat near the back and pressed my forehead against the cold window, watching the city pass by in a blur of lights and decorated houses, where families were gathering for the exact holiday I'd just been exiled from. Through lit windows, I could see Christmas trees and people laughing, children in pajamas, parents passing plates of cookies. And each glimpse felt like a knife twisting in my chest because I'd wanted that so badly, had driven through snow and brought gifts and hoped that maybe this time would be different, that maybe this time they'd see me as something other than a disappointment or a resource to be tapped. My studio apartment was dark and cold when I finally got there, climbing 3 flights of stairs because the elevator was broken again, and I stood in the doorway for a long moment before turning on the lights, looking at the space that suddenly felt unbearably small and lonely. Just 400 square feet that cost me $1,800 a month, a Murphy bed that folded down from the wall, a desk covered in notebooks and my laptop, a tiny kitchen where I'd planned to heat up leftover Chinese food for my Christmas dinner. I sat down in the dark without taking off my wet coat, my phone in my hand, staring at my mother's contact information, my thumb hovering over the call button because part of me wanted to apologize, to say I'd changed my mind, to offer them the $50,000 if it meant I could have my family back, even if that family had never really seen me for who I was. I didn't call my mother that night, and I didn't call the next day or the day after that. And instead, I opened my laptop and looked at TaskFlow Pro with new eyes, seeing it not as a side project or a dream, but as my future. The thing I would pour every ounce of energy into, because it was mine in a way nothing else had ever been. And I worked through Christmas Day, while the apartment stayed silent and my phone never rang, refining the user interface and fixing small bugs, and preparing for my January meeting with Riverside Ventures, a mid-sized VC firm that had expressed interest after seeing my beta metrics. That meeting in January changed everything, and I remember sitting in their glass-walled conference room on the 32nd floor overlooking the city, my portfolio spread across the table, demonstrating task flow to three partners who actually listened, who asked intelligent questions about user acquisition costs and retention rates and scalability, who saw what I'd built not as a fantasy, but as a viable business. And when they offered me $250,000 in seed funding for 15% equity, I had to work hard not to cry right there in front of them because someone finally believed in me, finally saw value in what I'd created. I gave notice at my job in mid-January, walking away from the glorified secretary position that had paid my bills for 3 years, and my boss, who'd always been kind to me even if he didn't understand my ambitions, shook my hand and said, "I had a feeling you were destined for bigger things." And I started working on TaskFlow full-time from my studio apartment, spending the seed money carefully, strategically, hiring 2 developers I'd connected with through coding forums, and 1 marketing specialist who understood the productivity software space. We launched officially in February, a quiet Tuesday morning when I pushed the app live on both iOS and Android platforms, and then I sat back and watched the download numbers start to climb, 10 in the first hour, 50 by lunchtime, 200 by the end of the day, and within the first week, we had 10,000 downloads, and by the end of March, we'd hit 50,000, with users leaving reviews that talked about how TaskFlow had transformed their work-life balance, helped them manage complex projects, given them back hours of their lives. TechCrunch reached out in late February, a staff writer who'd discovered TaskFlow and wanted to do a feature, and the article that ran in early March called it an elegantly simple solution to modern productivity challenges, and described me as a solo founder who bootstrapped her way to a product that's resonating with everyone from freelancers to Fortune 500 employees. And that article brought a flood of new users, and suddenly I was getting messages from other founders, invitations to startup events, inquiries from larger investors. My life transformed in ways I hadn't anticipated, not just financially, though the revenue from premium subscriptions was starting to come in steadily, but emotionally, psychologically, because I'd found my people in the startup community, other founders who understood the obsession and the fear and the exhilaration of building something from nothing, and I became friends with Lisa Wang, a successful entrepreneur who'd sold her last company for $40 million and now mentored early-stage founders, and she told me over coffee one morning, "You have something special here, Sarah. Don't let anyone make you doubt that." And I realized I was starting not to doubt it anymore. I still checked my phone hoping for messages from my family. Still felt a sharp pain when I saw Marcus post photos of his restaurant's opening on Instagram. A trendy-looking space with exposed brick and Edison bulbs, and a menu that seemed ambitious for someone with no restaurant experience, and I felt conflicted looking at those photos because I was relieved I hadn't invested my money in something that was already getting mediocre reviews according to Yelp. But I took no joy in watching him struggle, no satisfaction in being right about my doubts. because he was still my brother even if he'd never treated me like a sister. By the end of March, TaskFlow had 100,000 active users. I'd moved my operation from my apartment to a small shared office space, and I was sleeping better than I had in years, waking up excited about work instead of dreading it. Surrounded by a team that respected my vision and a mentor who believed in my potential, and while the silence from my family still hurt, still left a hollow space in my chest when I let myself think about it, I was learning that I could build a life without their approval, that my worth wasn't determined by whether they finally saw me clearly. By August, TaskFlow had crossed 500,000 active users and was generating $50,000 in monthly recurring revenue that was growing at 20% month over month. Numbers that seemed unreal when I looked at the analytics dashboard each morning. And I was in the middle of closing a Series A funding round that would bring in $2 million at a $10 million valuation, which meant my equity was now worth approximately $1.5 million on paper, a figure that made me lightheaded when my lawyer explained it to me during our meeting about term sheets and dilution and vesting schedules. Forbes reached out in July to feature me in their 30 Under 30 list for enterprise technology, sending a photographer to our new office space for a shoot where I felt ridiculous posing with my laptop and smiling confidently for the camera. But when the article ran in early August with the headline, "How Sarah Chen Built TaskFlow into the Productivity Tool Everyone's Talking About," I stared at my own face on the glossy page and couldn't quite believe this was my life now, that I was someone being celebrated instead of dismissed, recognized instead of overlooked. The interview requests started coming steadily after that, podcasts wanting to hear my founder story, tech conferences inviting me to speak on panels about bootstrapping and product market fit, and my LinkedIn was flooded with messages from recruiters trying to poach my team members and investors wanting to get in on our next round. And I moved out of my studio apartment into a spacious one-bedroom in a better neighborhood with actual closet space and a kitchen where I could cook real meals, and I let myself go out for nice dinners with my team and took a long weekend vacation to the coast where I walked on the beach and tried to remember the last time I'd felt this settled in my own skin. I'd started seeing a therapist in June, finally admitting that I needed help processing what had happened with my family, and Dr. Martinez was helping me understand that their treatment of me had never been about my actual worth, but about their own limitations, their inability to see value in anything that didn't match their narrow definitions of success. And she kept saying, "You can't earn love from people who've decided you're not enough, Sarah. You can only decide to stop trying." And those words were slowly sinking in, changing something fundamental in how I saw myself and my relationship to the family that had rejected me. I was building what Dr. Martinez called a chosen family, people who saw me clearly and valued me genuinely, and I'd gotten close with my small team and was dating casually and had reconnected with friends from college who'd always believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. And my friend Jessica asked me one evening over wine, "Have you told your parents about everything that's happened? About Forbes and the funding and all of it?" And I said, "They haven't called, so I'm not reaching out." But the truth was, I thought about it constantly, imagined their reactions, played out scenarios in my head where they saw the article and realized they'd been wrong about me. And part of me desperately wanted that vindication, while another part knew that if they couldn't support me before I had visible success markers, I shouldn't need to buy their love with achievement. But still, I checked my phone hoping for a message that never came, still felt that hollow space in my chest when I let myself acknowledge how much their silence hurt. The LinkedIn message came in October, a Tuesday afternoon when I was in the middle of reviewing our Q3 metrics with my team, and I glanced at my phone to see a notification from Jennifer Chen, Marcus's wife, someone I hadn't heard from since that last Christmas Eve, and the message was professional and distant in tone, saying, "Sarah, I saw your Forbes feature. Really impressive. Would you be open to getting coffee sometime? It would be good to catch up." And I stared at those words, feeling suspicion rise immediately in my chest, because why now, After 10 months of silence, after not one message asking how I was or acknowledging what had happened, would she suddenly want to catch up? And I knew with absolute certainty that this wasn't about reconnection, but about something they wanted from me. I debated ignoring the message entirely, letting it sit unanswered the way my existence had been unanswered for nearly a year. But curiosity won out over pride, and I wrote back, agreeing to meet that Saturday morning at a coffee shop halfway between our neighborhoods, somewhere neutral, where I could leave easily if I needed to. And when Saturday came, I arrived 10 minutes early and ordered my coffee and sat at a corner table watching the door. And Jennifer walked in 15 minutes late looking tired and stressed in a way I'd never seen her before, with dark circles under her eyes, and her hair pulled back hastily, and her designer bag replaced with something ordinary from Target. The small talk felt forced and awkward, both of us asking surface-level questions about work and weather, while the real conversation hung between us unspoken. And finally, Jennifer took a breath and said, "I'll just be direct, Sarah. Marcus's restaurant is failing. We're about $200,000 in debt and we don't know what to do." And I felt vindication and sadness mixed together in my stomach because I'd known this would happen, had seen it coming from the moment they dismissed my concerns as pessimism. But there was no joy in being right, just a heavy sense of waste. Jennifer continued, her words coming faster now like she needed to get them out before she lost courage. "Your parents refinanced their house to invest another $100,000 6 months ago, and now we're all going to lose everything. The restaurant will close, they'll lose the house, and Sarah, we know you've done well. We've seen the articles and heard about your funding rounds, and the family needs help." And there it was, the real reason for this coffee meeting. Not reconciliation or apology, but money, always money. The thing they demanded from me last Christmas, and the only reason I mattered to them now. I looked at Jennifer across the table, this woman who'd stood in my parents' living room, and asked, "After everything they've done for you?" When I refused to sacrifice my dreams for Marcus's third failed venture, and I asked carefully, keeping my voice level, "What does Marcus say about this? And what do my parents say?" And she shifted uncomfortably in her chair and said, "They don't know I'm here. I'm reaching out on my own. But Sarah, they're family. You have the money now and we need help." And something cold and clear settled over me as I said, "They told me to never come back, Jennifer. Those were their exact words, and now you're here asking me to save them?" She had the grace to look uncomfortable for a moment before saying, "They were hurt, you have to understand. You refused to help when it really mattered." And I felt anger rise hot in my throat as I leaned forward and said, "I refuse to give up my dream for Marcus's third failed business. There's a difference." And I laid it out for her clearly, the pattern of favoritism and dismissal, the $80,000 given to Marcus for business school while my scholarship was dismissed, the down payment on his house while I lived in a studio apartment, the wedding they paid for while forgetting my birthday, every single time they chose him and diminished me. And Jennifer sat there looking defensive and said, "He's trying his best, Sarah. Not everyone can just create an app and get lucky." And the word lucky hit me like a slap, because luck had nothing to do with 3 years of work, nothing to do with the nights I stayed up coding after working full days, nothing to do with the research and testing and validation I'd done before risking everything. I asked her directly, "Did Marcus have a business plan for the restaurant? Did he do market research? Did he validate his concept or create financial projections?" And she had no answers, just more deflection about how he'd followed his passion and how my parents believed in him. And I said quietly, "That's not how business works, Jennifer. You don't just follow passion and hope for success." I spent 3 years researching and testing task flow before I ever asked for investment. And I actually offered to help Marcus with business planning years ago, and he dismissed me. And I could see her getting frustrated now, her voice rising slightly as she said, "So you'll just let them lose everything out of spite? Is that it?" I looked at Jennifer across that coffee shop table and said clearly, calmly, "I'm not letting them lose everything out of spite, Jennifer. I'm letting them face the consequences of their choices, the same way I had to face mine when they kicked me out." And I could see her face flush with frustration, but I kept going because this needed to be said, needed to be heard by someone from that family who'd been complicit in my erasure. I was alone on Christmas, Jennifer, completely alone for the first time in my life, and then I was alone on my birthday in January. And when TaskFlow launched in February, and I was terrified it would fail, I was alone then too. And when I got my first investor meeting, and my first press coverage, and hit my first 100,000 users, I was alone for all of it. Not one call from any of you asking how I was, or if I was okay, or even acknowledging that I existed. And my voice was shaking now, but not with weakness, with the force of 10 months of silence finally being broken. Jennifer opened her mouth to respond, but I held up my hand because I wasn't finished. And now I have something you want. Now that I've built something successful without any of you, suddenly I'm family again. Suddenly I matter enough to meet for coffee and talk about helping each other. But where were you when I needed help? When I needed someone to believe in me the way they believed in Marcus? She leaned back in her chair, looking uncomfortable, and said, "They're proud people, Sarah. You know how they are. They're not good at admitting when they're wrong." And I almost laughed at that, the idea that pride was an excuse for cruelty, for telling their daughter to never come back, for 10 months of silence. "Pride," I said quietly. "They have enough pride to demand my money, but not enough pride to apologize, not enough to admit they were wrong about me, wrong about my app being a fantasy, wrong about me being average and not worth investing in." And I watched Jennifer's face change as she realized I wasn't going to give in, wasn't going to be guilted or manipulated into saving people who'd never saved me. I took a breath and said what I'd been working up to through months of therapy, through conversations with Dr. Martinez about boundaries and self-worth. "If they want my help, Jennifer, they can ask me themselves. They can call me or show up at my door, and they can start by apologizing for what they said and how they treated me. And then maybe, we can talk about what help looks like." And she stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor, and said, "I'll tell them you refuse to help. I'll tell them they were right about you being selfish." And she grabbed her Target bag and walked out without looking back, leaving her half-finished coffee on the table between us. I sat there alone, my hands shaking as I wrapped them around my own cup, feeling terrible and strong and sad and validated all at once. The way you feel when you finally stand up for yourself after years of being pushed down, and I pulled out my phone and texted Dr. Martinez, even though it was Saturday, just 2 words. Held my boundary, and then I added, "Feels terrible and right simultaneously." And I sat in that coffee shop for another 20 minutes watching people come and go, families and couples and friends, and I thought about how I'd built a life without my family, how I'd proven them wrong about everything, and how I still, somehow, hoped they'd come back different, changed, ready to see me clearly. But I wasn't going to sacrifice myself for that hope anymore. 3 weeks passed after that coffee shop meeting with Jennifer. 3 weeks during which TaskFlow continued its trajectory upward, with our user base hitting 750,000 and our Series A funding round finally closing with $2.3 million raised at a $12 million valuation. And I threw myself into work the way I always did when emotions threatened to overwhelm me, spending long days at our small office in Soma, coordinating with our now 8-person team, and longer evenings refining our product roadmap and growth strategy. Thanksgiving was approaching, and I'd already made plans to spend it with Jessica and her family in Berkeley, grateful to have somewhere to go, even if it meant being the perpetual single friend at someone else's family table, and I'd convinced myself that I was fine with spending another major holiday without my own family, that I'd made peace with the silence that had stretched now for 11 months since that snowy Christmas Eve. The unknown number appeared on my phone on a Tuesday afternoon while I was reviewing analytics dashboards, and I almost didn't answer because unknown numbers were usually reporters or recruiters or occasionally investors I'd met briefly at networking events. But something made me swipe to accept the call, and I heard my mother's voice for the first time in nearly a year, strained and formal and careful in a way that immediately set my heart pounding, saying, "Sarah, it's Mom." And then there was a long pause during which neither of us spoke, and I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line while I stood frozen in the middle of my apartment. She finally continued, her words coming slowly like she was pulling each one from somewhere deep and difficult. Jennifer said you two met, that you're doing well with your company. And I responded simply with yes, task flow is doing well, keeping my voice neutral and giving her nothing more than the basic confirmation because I wasn't going to make this easy for her, wasn't going to fill the silence with nervous chatter the way I might have done a year ago. Another pause stretched between us, longer this time, and I could hear her struggling with whatever she'd called to say before she finally managed, "We'd like to see you, Sarah. Maybe we could talk." And my heart was pounding so hard now that I could hear it in my ears because this was the call I'd wanted for 11 months. The acknowledgement of my existence, the reaching out, except the tone was all wrong, still careful and measured rather than warm or apologetic, still somehow making me feel like I was the problem that needed to be managed. I asked carefully, "Talk about what, Mom?" And she said, "About family, about helping each other." And I noticed immediately that there was still no apology in her words, no acknowledgement of what they'd said or how they'd treated me, just this vague suggestion of talking and helping, and I felt something cold settle in my chest as I asked directly, "Are you asking me for money?" Her voice shifted immediately to defensive, saying, "We're in a difficult situation, Sarah. Marcus worked so hard on the restaurant and things just didn't work out the way we hoped. And now we're facing some challenges and we thought maybe—" But I interrupted her because I couldn't listen to her talk about Marcus's hard work without acknowledging my own, saying, "Mom, you told me to never come back. You said I wasn't worth investing in. You said I'd never been exceptional at anything." And she responded quickly with, "We were upset, Sarah. You have to understand we were just upset and worried about Marcus, and you have to understand—" But I cut her off again, asking, "What I don't hear is an apology, Mom. What I hear is that you want something from me." And her tone shifted completely then, from careful to angry as she said, "We gave you everything. We raised you and fed you and put a roof over your head, and now you're going to let us lose our house because you're still angry about one argument?" "One argument," I said, and I could hear my voice rising now despite my efforts to stay calm, because this wasn't one argument and we both knew it. This wasn't one argument, Mom. This was a pattern that went on for years. This was you missing my college graduation to go to Marcus's anniversary dinner. This was you forgetting my 25th birthday while throwing Marcus a surprise party. This was you taking the money I gave you for your surgery and Dad's car repairs, but telling me I'd never contributed meaningfully to the family. This was every single time I needed support or recognition, and you chose Marcus instead. And I was listing specifics now, amounts and dates and moments, $80,000 for his business school and down payment and wedding, while I worked 2 jobs to put myself through state university, which you called not a real school. $50,000 you demanded for his third failed business while dismissing my app as a fantasy. And my mother was trying to interrupt, but I kept going because all of this needed to be said, had needed to be said for years. "You gave Marcus everything," I said more quietly now, the anger draining into something sadder and deeper. "You gave him money and belief and support and second chances and third chances. You gave him your retirement savings and your house as collateral, but you gave me criticism and demands and the message over and over that I wasn't enough, that I'd never be exceptional, that I wasn't worth investing in." And my mother responded with the excuse I'd known was coming, saying, "We helped Marcus because he needed it, Sarah. You were always so independent. You never seemed to need us the way he did." And I felt something break inside me hearing that because it was the final confirmation that they'd mistaken my forced self-reliance for not needing love, that they'd interpreted my survival mechanism as preference. "I was independent because I had no choice, Mom," I said, and my voice was shaking now with tears I was trying to hold back. "I was independent because every time I reached for you, you pushed me toward Marcus's kids, or Marcus's problems, or Marcus's needs. You pushed me away so many times that I learned to stop reaching. But that didn't mean I didn't need you, it just meant I learned not to show it. And there was a long silence on the other end of the line before my mother tried the emotion card, her voice taking on that trembling quality she used when she wanted sympathy, saying, "Your father has been losing sleep over this, Sarah. His health isn't good and the stress is affecting him, and I don't know how much longer." But I interrupted her because I couldn't listen to her weaponize Dad's health without pointing out the hypocrisy, asking, "Where was your concern for my health when you kicked me out on Christmas Eve, Mom? Where was your worry about my stress when I was alone and hurting and trying to build a company with no support from my family?" She went back to anger then, her voice rising as she said, "You chose money over family, Sarah. You chose your bank account over your brother's dream and your parents' security." And I realized in that moment that she would never understand, would never see that I hadn't chosen money over family, but had chosen myself over their endless demands. So I said quietly and clearly, "I chose myself, Mom. For the first time in my life, I chose myself and my dreams and my future, and I'm not going to apologize for that." And she said, "So that's it. You'll do nothing. You'll just let us lose everything." And I took a deep breath, centering myself the way Dr. Martinez had taught me, and said, "If you and Dad and Marcus want to have dinner and actually talk, not about money, but about our relationship and what happened, and how we got here, I'll consider it. But if all you want is my checkbook, then we have nothing to discuss." And my mother's response was immediate and cold, saying, "What's there to talk about, Sarah? We need help now, not conversations about feelings." And I said quietly, "Then I guess we have nothing to discuss." And she made one last attempt, her voice taking on that particular tone that had always made me feel guilty before, saying, "You'll regret this, Sarah. When we're gone, you'll regret not helping when you had the chance. You'll have to live with that." And the tears finally came as I said, "I already have regrets, Mom. I have so many regrets. But the biggest one is all the years I believed you when you said I wasn't enough." And I hung up before she could respond, before she could say anything else that would burrow into my brain and make me doubt myself. I sat on my couch in my nice apartment in my successful life, and I broke down completely, crying in a way I hadn't cried since that snowy Christmas Eve, crying with anger and relief and grief and loss all mixed together, mourning the family I'd wanted and never had, mourning the mother who could call after 11 months and still not apologize, and after 20 minutes of sobbing, I called Dr. Martinez's emergency line because I knew I couldn't process this alone, and when she called back 15 minutes later, I told her everything and she listened, and then she said gently, "Sarah, you hoped they'd changed, but they've only changed their circumstances, not their perspective." And I realized she was right. They didn't want me. They wanted my resources. They didn't see me any differently than they had on Christmas Eve. They just needed something from the daughter they'd thrown away. And that truth hurt worse than anything they'd said. Thanksgiving week arrived and I threw myself into work with even more intensity than usual, coordinating our upcoming product release and finalizing partnerships with 3 enterprise clients who would bring our monthly recurring revenue past $80,000. And I'd made plans to spend the actual holiday with Jessica and her family in Berkeley because the thought of being alone on another major holiday felt unbearable, even though I'd convinced myself I was fine with my chosen family arrangement. I was reviewing contract terms on Wednesday afternoon, 2 days before Thanksgiving, when my doorbell rang unexpectedly, and I wasn't expecting any deliveries or visitors. And when I opened the door, Marcus was standing there in my hallway, looking exhausted and defeated, and somehow older than his 29 years, his face drawn and his shoulders slumped in a way I'd never seen before. And my first instinct was to close the door, but shock kept me frozen as he asked quietly, "Can I come in?" And I stepped aside wordlessly because I needed to know why he was here, what new manipulation this was. The living room felt too small with both of us in it, all the air suddenly thick and awkward as we stood there not knowing how to begin. And finally we both sat down on opposite ends of my couch, maintaining careful distance, and Marcus looked around my apartment, taking in the details: the modern furniture and the framed TechCrunch article on the wall, and the expensive laptop open on my coffee table, all the visible markers of a success he'd dismissed as fantasy less than a year ago. "Mom said you won't help unless we apologize," he began, and I felt anger flash through me at this characterization, responding, "That's not exactly what I said, Marcus. I said I'd consider talking if you all wanted to actually address our relationship, not just my bank account." And he nodded slowly, accepting the correction. And then there was a long silence, during which he seemed to be gathering courage for something. "I saw your TechCrunch interview," he said finally, "and I read the Forbes profile, the whole thing, not just skimming for your company valuation." And I waited, unsure where this was going, keeping my expression neutral and my walls firmly up. "You really built something," he continued, struggling with each word like they cost him something to say. "I didn't think, I didn't understand what you were doing back when you were coding every night. I thought it was just a hobby or something you'd get tired of." And I said quietly, "No one asked, Marcus. No one asked what I was building or why, or if they could help. You all just dismissed it." And he nodded again, looking down at his hands. "I know," he said. "We didn't take you seriously. I didn't take you seriously. And that was wrong." And it was the first real acknowledgement I'd heard from anyone in my family. The first crack in the defensive wall they'd all maintained, and I felt something shift in my chest, some small lessening of the pressure I'd been carrying. Marcus continued before I could respond, saying, "I'm not here to ask for money. Jennifer and Mom don't know I came. They'd be furious if they knew." And he explained that the restaurant was definitely failing, that they'd be declaring bankruptcy within the month, that he was applying for regular jobs in restaurant management and retail, anything that would pay the bills. And the parents are going to lose the house. It's going into foreclosure in January. And Sarah, it's my fault. All of it is my fault. And I saw real remorse in his face, not the manipulation I'd been braced for, but genuine regret and shame. "Why are you here, Marcus?" I asked, needing to understand his purpose, needing to know if this was real or just another version of the same old patterns. And he looked up at me with eyes that looked startlingly vulnerable and said simply, "To apologize, because you deserved that a long time ago." "To apologize," Marcus said quietly, and the words seemed to cost him something real. "You deserved that a long time ago, Sarah. And I should have come months ago, but I was too ashamed and too proud and too caught up in my own failure." And he explained his perspective in a way he'd never been vulnerable enough to share before, telling me about always feeling pressure to be perfect, to be the son who succeeded, to justify all the investment and belief our parents had poured into him, and how each failure meant disappointing them more profoundly, carrying not just his own shame, but theirs too. And "they kept investing because they couldn't admit I wasn't a good businessman," he said with brutal honesty, "because admitting that would mean admitting they'd made mistakes, that their judgment was flawed, and it was easier to keep throwing money at the problem and believing the next venture would work." And I listened, really listened, processing this perspective I'd never considered because I'd been so focused on my own pain. Marcus continued, looking directly at me now, saying, "You were always smarter than me, Sarah, in school, with money, with planning, with everything that actually matters in building something sustainable." And I started to protest because this felt like manipulation, like setting up some ask. But he held up his hand and said, "Let me finish, please. I need to say this." And he admitted that he'd resented me for making things look easy when everything was hard for him, that watching me excel with no support while he struggled despite every advantage had made him feel worse about himself, not better. And "it was easier to dismiss you than admit I was jealous," he said. "Easier to join Mom and Dad in calling your achievements small than to acknowledge that you were doing more with nothing than I was doing with everything. And Sarah, I'm so sorry for that, for every time I diminished you to make myself feel less inadequate." I felt tears starting because this was real. This wasn't the manipulation I'd been braced for, but actual self-awareness and remorse. And I asked quietly, "Do you know what it felt like, Marcus? Being invisible in my own family? Watching you get celebrated for things I'd done better years earlier? Being told I wasn't worth investing in while you got chance after chance?" And Marcus nodded slowly and said, "I do now. I understand now because since the restaurant failed, I'm the disappointment, the one they can barely look at, the one whose calls they don't return. And they're directing at me now what they directed at you for years. And Sarah, I finally understand what it cost you." And we sat there in that moment of connection, both of us damaged by parents whose love had always been conditional on meeting their expectations, both of us realizing we'd been pitted against each other in a competition neither of us had wanted. I asked the question that mattered most, needing to understand his real purpose. "What do you want from me, Marcus? What's the actual reason you're here?" And he said simply, "Nothing. I don't want anything except to say I'm sorry, for all of it. For Christmas Eve and the things I said about your app being a fantasy and not standing up for you when I should have. For every family dinner where I let them treat you like you didn't matter. I'm sorry, and you deserved better from your brother." And I asked through tears, "Why now? Why after all this time?" And Marcus said, "Because I finally understand what it cost you. Really understand it. And because you deserve to hear this whether or not you ever speak to me again. You deserved better, and I'm sorry I didn't give it to you." The genuineness in his voice, the complete absence of any ask for money or help, made something in me soften despite my determination to keep my walls up, and I said carefully, "I can't fix this for you, Marcus. I can't save the restaurant or the parents' house or make this all go away." And he said immediately, "I know, and I don't want you to. We made our choices, and we have to live with the consequences. I just wanted you to know that I see you now. I see what you built and who you are, and I'm sorry I didn't see it before." And then he asked tentatively, "Do you think we could start over? Not go back to what we were, but start from here, build something new?" And I considered this carefully, thinking about Dr. Martinez's words about healthy boundaries and chosen family, and said, "Maybe, slowly if you mean it." And Marcus nodded with what looked like relief and stood to leave, and at my door he turned back and said, "I'm proud of you, Sarah. I should have said that a long time ago, but I'm saying it now. What you built with TaskFlow is remarkable, and you did it alone, and that makes it even more impressive." And I watched him walk down the hallway, feeling something shift inside me, some small piece of the hurt beginning to transform into possibility. December arrived, and with it came the 1-year anniversary of the night I'd walked into the snow carrying nothing but my purse and my wounded pride. And TaskFlow now had 1.2 million active users across 43 countries with monthly recurring revenue of $135,000. And my equity stake was worth approximately $3 million after the Series A had closed in October. And I'd been a featured speaker at Tech Summit in November where people had actually lined up to ask me questions about scaling startup culture. And sometimes I still couldn't believe this was my life, that I was the person other entrepreneurs asked for advice, that my app was being used by companies I'd once dreamed of working for. Christmas Eve arrived, and I was hosting dinner at my apartment for my chosen family, the people who'd celebrated every milestone with me over this transformative year. My core team of 5, Jessica and 2 other college friends, Lisa Wang, who'd become not just a mentor, but a genuine friend, and Marcus, who'd been slowly rebuilding our relationship over careful coffee meetings and honest conversations. And I was in the kitchen preparing the meal I'd planned, with perhaps too much ambition, when my doorbell rang at 4:30, 2 hours before guests were due to arrive, and I opened it to find my father standing in the hallway alone, wearing a coat I didn't recognize and looking smaller somehow than I remembered, older and more uncertain. And my first reaction was a flash of pure anger as I asked, "How did you get my address?" And he said quietly, "Marcus gave it to me, asked if I could come talk to you. And Sarah, I know I have no right to be here." We stood there looking at each other across the threshold, a year of silence and hurt hanging in the air between us. Every cruel word from last Christmas echoing in my memory, along with all the years of dismissal before that. And I considered closing the door because I had people coming who actually valued me. I had a life now that didn't include him, but something in his posture, the complete absence of his usual certainty and authority, made me step aside and gesture him in without speaking. He entered slowly, looking around my apartment with careful attention, taking in the modern furniture and the artwork I'd chosen, and the framed magazine covers on the wall, and the evidence of success he'd told me I'd never achieve. And he sat down heavily on my couch, like the walk from the door had exhausted him, while I remained standing, because I needed the height advantage, needed to not be the small daughter looking up at disapproving father. And finally he said, "I've been a fool, Sarah, about so many things." And I asked, keeping my voice carefully neutral, "About what, specifically? Because I need you to name it, Dad. I need you to say what you're apologizing for." And he nodded like he'd expected this and said, "About you, about what matters, about what I said last Christmas, and every dismissive thing I said before that, about comparing your achievements to Marcus's and finding you wanting when I should have seen that you were building something remarkable with no help while he was failing with every advantage." He described the past year, and I listened without interrupting. Losing the house to foreclosure in March, moving to a small two-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood they'd never have considered before, watching their retirement savings disappear into Marcus's bankruptcy, and Marcus himself working retail management at a sporting goods store, while Jennifer had gone back to teaching full-time, and they'd had to pull the kids from private school. "And your mother blames you for not helping," he said. "But Sarah, I blame myself for creating a situation where we needed help, for investing everything in the wrong things, for not seeing what was right in front of me." And I asked, still guarded, still protecting myself, "Why are you here, Dad? What do you actually want?" He looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before, something vulnerable and genuinely remorseful, and said, "Marcus showed me your Forbes interview, really read it, not just skimmed for numbers, but read what you said about building tools that help people be their best selves. And Sarah, that's who you've always been, helping and building and making things better. And I couldn't see it because it wasn't what I expected, wasn't the path I understood. And I measured you against the wrong standards and told you that you weren't enough, when the truth is I wasn't enough. I wasn't the father you deserved." My father continued speaking into the silence I'd left, saying, "I compared you to Marcus because that's what I understood, business degrees and traditional paths, and the markers of success my father taught me to value." And he admitted something I'd never expected to hear, that his own father had dismissed his dreams of being an architect and pushed him into accounting, that he'd spent 40 years in a career that never fulfilled him. And I repeated the pattern, Sarah. I measured you against standards that didn't fit who you are, and I told myself I was being realistic when I was actually being cruel. And then he asked the question that hung between us, with all its weight and impossibility and hope. "I told you to never come back, but Sarah, I'm asking now, can I stay?" And I stood there processing anger and hurt, and the part of me that had wanted this moment for a year, and also seeing his genuine remorse in the way his hands shook slightly and his voice cracked on my name. And I asked the question that mattered. "What about Mom?" And he said quietly, "She's still angry, may always be angry. She's not ready to admit she was wrong, and I can't make her come before she's ready. But I can't lose my daughter because of pride, Sarah. I can't spend the rest of my life knowing I threw away something precious because I was too stubborn to see what was in front of me." And my tears finally came, all the hurt of that Christmas Eve and every dismissal before it. And I said through the crying, "You already lost me, Dad. Last Christmas when you told me to leave, when you said I wasn't worth investing in, you lost me then." And he nodded, accepting this truth, and said, I know I did, and I can't undo that. But I'm asking if there's any way to find you again. Not the daughter you were, but the woman you've become. If there's any possibility of building something new from here." And I thought about revenge. How easy it would be to turn him away like he'd turned me away, to let him feel the rejection I'd felt. But Dr. Martinez's voice was in my head asking what I actually wanted, not what would hurt him, but what would heal me. And I realized I didn't want vindication anymore. I wanted genuine family, people who saw me and valued me and chose me not for what I could give them, but for who I was. And I said carefully, "It won't be the same, Dad. I won't go back to being invisible, to being the daughter who gives and gets nothing back. If we do this, it has to be different." And he said immediately, "I don't want it to be the same, Sarah. I want to know who you actually are. I want to hear about your work and your life and what matters to you. I want to be your father in the way I should have been all along." And I made a decision that felt both terrifying and right, saying, "I'm hosting dinner tonight for my team and friends, people who've supported me this year, and you can stay if you want. Meet them, see this part of my life." And relief washed over his face as he nodded and said, "I'd like that very much if you're sure." And the evening unfolded with my chosen family arriving and my father meeting each of them, listening to my lead developer, Rachel, talk about my leadership style and how I'd built a culture of innovation, hearing Lisa Wang describe mentoring me and being continually impressed by my strategic thinking, watching my team tell stories about problem-solving sessions and product launches and the way I'd navigated the startup world. And I saw him seeing me through their eyes as capable and visionary and kind, seeing the respect these accomplished people had for me, understanding finally what he'd missed all these years. At the end of the night, my father stood at my door with his coat on and asked tentatively, "Can I call you, Sarah? Maybe meet for coffee next week?" And I said, "Maybe. We'll see. Let's take this slowly." And he nodded and said, "Thank you for tonight, for letting me see this, for giving me a chance I don't deserve." And after he left, I returned to my friends, and Lisa asked quietly, "You okay?" And I said, "Yeah, I think I finally am," and meant it in a way I hadn't been able to mean it before. Dershai? After everyone had gone home and I was alone in my apartment with the dishes done and the leftovers put away, I stood at my window looking out at the city lights and the light snow that had just begun to fall, and I thought about how exactly 1 year ago I'd walked into snow like this feeling worthless and alone, and questioning every choice I'd made. And now I stood here with a successful company and a team who respected me and friends who chose me, and a brother I was slowly rebuilding a relationship with, and a father who was at least trying to see me. And I realized that the vindication I'd imagined wasn't about them acknowledging my success, but about me finally knowing my own worth, independent of their recognition. They told me never to come back, and so I didn't. I went forward instead into a life I built with my own hands and my own vision, and that made all the difference in ways I couldn't have understood that snowy Christmas Eve when I'd felt so small and dismissed and worthless. Some people would say I should forget everything that happened, forgive easily, welcome them back without hesitation or boundaries. But I learned something important that night when I walked away from my family. My worth isn't determined by their recognition. It never was. And while I might let them back into my life eventually, it will be on my terms, in my time, into the life I built without them. And that's not cruelty or vindictiveness, but survival and self-respect. And finally, after 26 years of seeking their approval, putting myself first.